In Grand Island, Nebraska, a 75-year-old former high school principal was about to uncover a betrayal that would turn his quiet retirement upside down. What began as an ordinary family dinner at his son's farmhouse transformed into a life-altering moment when he overheard a conversation that revealed his children's true intentions for his estate. Harold Wilkins wasn't your average retiree living in a modest ranch house on the outskirts of town. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. For over 35 years, Harold had shaped the minds of countless students at Grand Island Central High School, eventually becoming its most respected principal. Known for his fairness, sharp intellect, and ability to see through teenage excuses, he had earned the nickname Eye Wilkins among generations of students. His attention to detail had served him well throughout his career, and it was about to become his greatest asset once more. The autumn wind scattered golden leaves across Harold's front yard as he prepared for the monthly family dinner at his eldest son's home. At 75, his movements were deliberate but steady, his mind as clear as it had been during his decades in education. He adjusted his reading glasses and checked his appearance in the hallway mirror, running a hand through his silver hair before grabbing the pecan pie he'd baked that morning, a family recipe his late wife Catherine had perfected during their 47 years of marriage. Harold slid behind the wheel of his meticulously maintained 1989 Ford pickup, the same vehicle he'd driven to school for the last 15 years of his career. The familiar route to his son Michael's sprawling farmhouse on the outskirts of Grand Island took him past cornfields turned amber in the October light, their stalks rustling in the prairie breeze. The 20-minute drive gave him time to reflect on how blessed he was to have his 3 children all living within an hour's drive, especially since Catherine's passing 3 years ago. Michael's 2-story farmhouse came into view, its white, clapboard exterior freshly painted, the wraparound porch adorned with pumpkins and harvest decorations. Harold noticed 4 cars in the driveway, more than he expected for what should have been a dinner with just Michael, his wife Diane, and Harold's other children, Rebecca and Thomas. He frowned slightly but pushed the concern aside. Perhaps the grandchildren had decided to join them after all. "Dad." Michael greeted him with a broad smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. At 50, Michael had inherited Harold's height and Catherine's gentle features, though years of managing the family's agricultural supply business had added stress lines around his mouth. "You're right on time as always." "Brought Catherine's pecan pie," Harold said, handing over the carefully wrapped dessert. "Didn't know we were having extra company today." Michael's smile faltered momentarily. "Just a few business associates. We wrapped up early, and they're about to leave." "Come on in, Rebecca and Tom are already here." The farmhouse kitchen was warm and fragrant with the smell of pot roast, Catherine's recipe that Diane had never quite mastered despite years of trying. Rebecca rose from the table, her corporate attorney attire looking out of place in the rustic setting. At 47, she had built a successful practice in Lincoln, specializing in estate planning and elder law. Thomas, the youngest at 43, remained seated, fingers tapping restlessly on his smartphone screen. He managed a string of quick-service restaurants across eastern Nebraska, his entrepreneurial spirit always keeping him on edge. "Dad," Rebecca embraced him with perfunctory affection. "You're looking well. How's the hip doing?" "Good as new," Harold replied, though the replacement surgery from last winter occasionally still reminded him of its presence. "Doctor says I'm moving better than men 10 years younger." Thomas finally glanced up from his phone. "That's great, Dad. Hey, we thought dinner would be at 6, you're a bit early." Harold checked his watch with a frown. "It's always been 5:30. For 20 years now." An uncomfortable silence fell over the kitchen. Diane busied herself with the oven while Michael cleared his throat. "Must have gotten our wires crossed." "No problem, though, my colleagues are just finishing up in the study. We'll eat as soon as they head out." Harold sensed the tension in the room but couldn't quite place its source. His principal's intuition, the same one that had helped him identify trouble before it erupted in school hallways, prickled at the back of his neck. Something wasn't right. "I'll just freshen up," he said, excusing himself to use the bathroom down the hall from Michael's study. As he passed the partially open study door, Harold heard hushed voices in mid-conversation. "The cognitive assessment is scheduled for Tuesday," said a voice he didn't recognize. "Dr. Larson is confident we can move forward with the competency evaluation immediately after. And once we have that documentation?" That was Rebecca's voice, professional and clinical. "The guardianship petition can be filed the same week," the stranger replied. "With your legal expertise and the medical assessment, it should move quickly through the courts." Harold froze, his hand gripping the hallway wall for support. Were they talking about him? Dad's been making concerning financial decisions. Michael said, his voice low but clear enough for Harold to hear. Last month he donated $5,000 to that school renovation project, and he's talking about setting up college funds for all the grandkids, money we need for the business expansion. The memory issues are the strongest basis for our case, Rebecca added. He forgot Thomas's birthday last month, and yesterday he called me by Mom's name twice. Classic early signs. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. What about the farmland? Asked another unfamiliar voice. That's the primary asset, correct? 200 acres of prime agricultural land. Thomas confirmed. Worth about $3 million in today's market. The plan is to sell once we have control. Michael gets the cash he needs for the business, I can expand my restaurant chain, and Rebecca takes her cut for handling the legal work. And your father's house? The voice asked. Liquidated for his care expenses, Rebecca answered smoothly. There's a new assisted living facility opening in Grand Island next spring. Nothing fancy, but adequate. Medicare will cover the basics, and whatever's left from the house sale can go toward extras. Harold's chest tightened as the full weight of what he was hearing crashed down on him. His children, the three people he loved most in the world, were plotting to have him declared incompetent, institutionalized, and stripped of everything he and Catherine had built over a lifetime. The farmland that had been in Catherine's family for 4 generations, meant to be preserved as their legacy, would be sold off to fund his children's business ventures. Footsteps approached the door, and Harold quickly moved toward the bathroom, closing the door quietly behind him. His hands trembled as he splashed cold water on his face, the shock giving way to a burning sense of betrayal. The face that stared back at him from the mirror was pale but determined, the same expression he'd worn when confronting troublesome school board members or standing up to budget cuts that would hurt his students. Harold had spent his career reading people, understanding motivations, and finding solutions to complex problems. He had faced down belligerent parents, guided troubled teens, and navigated the politics of public education for decades. This betrayal by his own flesh and blood was different, but it would require the same strategic thinking and strength of character that had defined his professional life. As he dried his hands, Harold made a decision. He would not confront them tonight. That would only alert them to his knowledge and potentially accelerate their plans. Instead, he would document everything, seek proper counsel, and prepare a response. That would protect not just his assets, but his dignity and independence. When he returned to the kitchen, the business associates, whom Harold now recognized as likely being an attorney and perhaps a medical consultant, were making their exit through the front door. His children's conversation had shifted to mundane topics, their faces composed into masks of casual family affection. "Everything all right, Dad?" Rebecca asked, studying his face with what now seemed like calculation rather than concern. "You look a little pale." "Just a bit tired," Harold replied, summoning the same calm demeanor he'd used to defuse tense situations throughout his career. Long day in the garden. Dinner proceeded with forced normalcy. Harold observed his children through new eyes, noting how they exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking, how they carefully steered the conversation toward his daily activities and routines, fishing for evidence of decline. "How's the checkbook balancing going?" Michael asked casually over dessert. "Mom always handled that, didn't she? Must be a challenge to keep track of everything." Harold cut a perfect slice of pecan pie before answering. "I managed a school. Budget of $12 million for 20 years, Michael. My personal finances aren't exactly taxing my abilities." "Of course not, Dad," Rebecca interjected smoothly. "But everyone needs help sometimes. I'd be happy to set up automatic bill payments for you, many of my clients find it simplifies things." "I'm sure they do," Harold replied, maintaining his composure while inwardly noting how quickly they were moving to gain control of his finances. "I prefer to review each bill as it comes in. Old habits die hard." Thomas, always the least subtle of his children, jumped in. "Speaking of old habits, Dad, we've been talking about the house. It's a lot of maintenance for someone your age. Have you considered downsizing?" Harold took a slow sip of coffee, buying time to control the anger and hurt threatening to surface. "The house suits me fine. Catherine and I chose it for our retirement, and I intend to honor that choice." The evening concluded with artificial warmth, his children insisting on walking him to his truck despite the mild weather and his obvious mobility. Their sudden solicitousness, Michael checking that his seatbelt was fastened, Rebecca reminding him to turn on his headlights, Thomas mentioning the tricky intersection near his home, now read as evidence gathering, attempts to document supposed declining capabilities. As Harold drove home through the darkness, the Nebraska field stretching out around him, he felt a cold resolve forming in his chest. For 35 years, he had championed his students, fighting for their best interests even when they couldn't see it themselves. Now, at 75, he would need to become his own advocate. The next morning, Harold woke before dawn, a lifetime habit from his years as principal. The betrayal he had discovered sat heavy in his chest, but his mind was clear and focused. He dressed with his usual care, pressed slacks, a button-down shirt, polished loafers, and made his way to his home office, a converted bedroom that still contained the heavy oak desk he'd used throughout his career. From the bottom drawer, Harold retrieved a leather-bound ledger where he had meticulously documented every financial transaction since Catherine's passing. Each entry was dated, categorized, and recorded in his precise handwriting, evidence of his continued mental acuity and financial responsibility. Next to it was a folder containing his medical records, including the results of his physical from just 2 months ago, where his doctor had noted his exceptional cognitive function and physical health for his age. Harold opened his laptop, a skill his children seemed to believe was beyond him, despite the fact that he had overseen the computerization of Grand Island Central High in the early 2000s. He began to research guardianship laws in Nebraska, taking careful notes on the standards for competency and the legal protections available to him. By mid-morning, Harold had composed a list of actions he needed to take. First on the list, seek counsel from someone with no connection to his children. Rebecca's influence in the legal community of eastern Nebraska posed a significant challenge. Harold thought of his former student, James Martinez, who had graduated 30 years ago and gone on to become a respected elder law attorney in Omaha. James had no connections to Rebecca's firm and had always expressed gratitude for Harold's mentorship during a difficult time in his teenage years. Harold dialed James's office number, relieved when the receptionist put him through immediately upon hearing his name. Principal Wilkins, James greeted him warmly. "This is an unexpected pleasure. What can I do for you?" "I need legal counsel, James," Harold said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind the words. "And I need absolute confidentiality, particularly from my daughter Rebecca's legal circles." There was a brief pause before James responded, his tone shifting from warm to professional. "I understand, Mr. Wilkins. I can assure you complete confidentiality. Can you tell me the nature of your concern?" Harold explained what he had overheard, his voice occasionally catching as he recounted his children's betrayal. James listened without interruption, and Harold could hear the scratching of a pen taking notes. "Mr. Wilkins, what you're describing is unfortunately not uncommon," James said when Harold finished. "Adult children sometimes convince themselves that their actions are in their parents' best interest, even when those actions are primarily self-serving. The good news is that Nebraska law provides strong protections against unwarranted guardianship petitions." "What should I do first?" Harold asked, his principal's instinct for decisive action kicking in. "Document everything," James advised. "Your mental capacity, your financial competence, your physical independence. We need to establish a clear record that predates any petition they might file. I'd like you to undergo an independent cognitive assessment with a geriatric specialist I trust in Omaha. Dr. Eleanor Richards has no connection to Grand Island medical circles." "I'll do that," Harold agreed. "What about my assets?" "That's our second priority," James said. "We need to review your estate plan immediately. When was the last time you updated your will?" Harold felt a flush of embarrassment. "After Catherine died, so about 3 years ago. Rebecca handled it." "Then we definitely need to revisit it," James said firmly. "Rebecca has a clear conflict of interest. I'd like you to come to Omaha tomorrow if possible. Bring all your financial records, medical documents, and the current will. We need to move quickly but carefully." The following day, Harold made the 90-minute drive to Omaha, telling his housekeeper he was attending a retired educator's luncheon in case his children called to check on him. The sprawling city was a stark contrast to the rural peace of Grand Island, but Harold navigated the traffic with the same confidence he'd shown throughout his life. James's office was located in a modern building downtown, the reception area. Warm and welcoming rather than imposingly formal. The attorney himself had aged well from the gangly teenager Harold remembered, now a distinguished man in his late 40s with compassionate eyes behind stylish glasses. "Mr. Wilkins," James rose to greet him with genuine respect. "Thank you for coming. I've arranged for Dr. Richards to see you this afternoon, and in the meantime, we'll review your documents and discuss your options." Over the next 3 hours, Harold and James methodically reviewed his financial situation, his current will, and the evidence of his continued competence. James took copious notes, occasionally asking clarifying questions but never once speaking to Harold with the condescending tone his children had recently adopted. Based on what you've shown me, James said finally, there is absolutely no legitimate basis for a guardianship petition. Your finances are impeccably managed, your cognitive function is clearly intact, and you're physically independent. This appears to be a transparent attempt to gain control of your assets, particularly the farmland. Harold nodded, a mixture of relief and sadness washing over him. What do we do now? We revise your estate plan immediately, James said, his expression serious. The current will, which Rebecca prepared, contains provisions that could be manipulated, particularly the clause about diminished capacity triggering certain distributions. We'll create a new will with ironclad protections and clear consequences for attempts to challenge your competence. What kind of consequences? Harold asked, his educator's belief in both justice and teachable moments coming to the fore. James smiled for the first time since they'd begun reviewing the documents. I believe in creating estate plans that reflect my client's values and wishes. From what you've told me about your life's work and principles, I'm thinking something that would be both legally sound and instructive. That afternoon, after completing a comprehensive cognitive assessment with Dr. Richards, who pronounced him to be cognitively sharper than many of my 50-year-old patients, Harold and James finalized the new estate plan. It contained several elements that gave Harold a sense of both security and satisfaction. First, a detailed medical directive appointing his former vice principal and dear friend, Eleanor Thompson, as his healthcare proxy instead of his children. Second, a revocable trust holding the farmland with strict provisions preventing its sale, instead directing that it be preserved through an agricultural conservation easement that would keep it as working farmland in perpetuity. Third, specific bequests to each grandchild's education, bypassing their parents' control. And finally, a clause that James referred to as the education provision, a carefully worded section that would prove to be the centerpiece of Harold's response to his children's betrayal. For the next 3 weeks, Harold maintained his normal routine, giving no indication that he was aware of his children's plans. He attended his regular checkup with his local doctor, deliberately mentioning Thomas's recent birthday celebration, which he had most certainly not forgotten, and discussing the financial details of his donation to the school renovation project, ensuring these comments were noted in his medical record. He also began keeping a daily journal documenting his activities, conversations, and decisions, evidence of his continued mental acuity. Most importantly, he arranged for his home security system to be upgraded to include indoor cameras in the common areas of his house, with footage backing up to a secure cloud server that only he and James could access. The Tuesday appointment his children had arranged with Dr. Larson arrived, and Harold received the expected call from Rebecca that morning. "Dad, I was thinking I could take you to lunch today," she said, her voice carefully casual. "There's a new place downtown I think you'd enjoy. I could pick you up around 11? "That sounds lovely," Harold replied, matching her tone while noting the time coincided perfectly with the appointment he'd overheard being discussed. "I'll be ready." Rebecca arrived precisely at 11, dressed in what Harold now recognized as her professional convincing outfit, the same conservative suit she wore to close important deals. As they drove toward downtown Grand Island, she made a show of taking a wrong turn. "Oh, I just remembered," she said with practiced spontaneity, "I scheduled a quick checkup for you with a wonderful doctor I know. Just a routine wellness visit, all my clients your age are doing them. It won't take long, and then we'll go to lunch. Is that okay, Dad?" "Of course," Harold replied mildly, noting how she had already pulled into the parking lot of a medical office building without waiting for his answer. Always good to stay on top of health matters. Dr. Larson's office was sleek and modern, with certificates prominently displayed that emphasized his specialization in geriatric medicine. The waiting room was empty except for them, and they were ushered immediately into an examination room, further evidence that this was no routine appointment but a carefully orchestrated evaluation. Dr. Larson himself was a thin man in his 50s. With an air of authority that Harold recognized from certain school administrators who relied on intimidation rather than earned respect. "Mr. Wilkins," he began without preamble, "your daughter has expressed some concerns about changes she's noticed in your memory and decision-making. I'd like to perform a cognitive assessment today." "Of course," Harold said agreeably. "Though I just had my annual physical with Dr. Granger 2 weeks ago." He found no concerns. A flicker of surprise crossed Rebecca's face before she composed herself. "Dad, Dr. Larson specializes in seniors. It's different from a regular checkup." The assessment that followed was clearly designed to identify deficits rather than strengths. Dr. Larson asked Harold to remember 3 words, then attempted to distract him with unrelated questions before asking for recall. He requested that Harold count backward from 100 by sevens, interrupting him repeatedly with additional instructions. Throughout the evaluation, Harold maintained his composure, answering each question accurately while noting how the doctor frowned at correct responses and seemed to document extensively when Harold paused even momentarily to consider a complex question. "Mr. Wilkins," Dr. Larson said finally, "I'm seeing some concerning patterns in your responses. There's evidence of mild cognitive impairment that could impact your ability to make sound financial and healthcare decisions." "That's interesting," Harold replied calmly. "Could you be specific about which responses indicated impairment? I'd like to understand the clinical basis for your conclusion." Dr. Larson seemed taken aback by the direct question. "Well, your hesitation on the mathematical calculations suggests processing difficulties, and you showed some uncertainty in temporal orientation." "I answered all the mathematical questions correctly," Harold pointed out. "And I accurately identified today's date, the current president, and my location. Which specific temporal orientation questions did I miss?" Rebecca intervened, her attorney instincts clearly sensing danger. "Dad, Dr. Larson is just being thorough. This is why we do these evaluations, to catch issues early." "Of course," Harold agreed pleasantly. "I'm simply trying to understand the diagnosis. As an educator, I've always valued clear assessment criteria." Dr. Larson cleared his throat uncomfortably. "I'll prepare a full report for your family to review. In the meantime, I would recommend that you consider allowing your children to assist with complex decisions, particularly regarding finances." "I appreciate your concern," Harold said, rising from his chair with deliberate steadiness. "I'll certainly give it due consideration. Rebecca, shall we go to lunch now? I believe you mentioned a new restaurant." The lunch that followed was strained, with Rebecca repeatedly attempting to steer the conversation toward topics that might reveal cognitive weaknesses, asking about events from decades ago, bringing up financial matters, and suggesting that managing his home was becoming too much for him. Harold parried each attempt skillfully, drawing on his years of experience handling difficult parent conferences. He deliberately mentioned details Rebecca wouldn't expect him to remember, discussed the specific performance of his investment portfolio, and described the extensive garden improvements he was planning for spring. When Rebecca dropped him at home later that afternoon, her frustrated expression told Harold all he needed to know about the success of her plan. As soon as her car disappeared down the street, he called James. "They've made their first move," he reported. A cognitive evaluation with a Dr. Larson, clearly arranged to provide documentation for a guardianship petition. "Did he provide a specific diagnosis?" James asked. "He claimed to observe mild cognitive impairment, but couldn't identify specific deficits when I questioned him," Harold replied. "He's preparing a report for my family to review." "Perfect," James said, and Harold could hear the satisfaction in his voice. "We've already established your cognitive competence with Dr. Richards, whose credentials far outweigh this Dr. Larson's. More importantly, your questioning of his methodology creates a record of your critical thinking skills." "Did you record the appointment as we discussed?" "Yes," Harold confirmed. "The digital recorder was in my breast pocket the entire time." "Excellent," James said. "Now we wait for their next move. Based on what you overheard, I expect they'll file for guardianship within the week. When they do, we'll be ready." 3 days later, Harold received a text message from Michael asking if the whole family could come over for dinner on Friday evening. "We have something important to discuss with you, Dad," the message concluded. Harold replied with a simple acceptance, then immediately called James. "Friday night," he said. "They're coming here to present a united front." "This is actually better than we expected," James replied. "Having all three of them present, in your home, with your recording devices in place, it's the perfect setting for what we've planned. Are you ready?" Harold thought about the lifetime of lessons he had tried to impart to his children, about integrity, respect, and the true meaning of family. He thought about Catherine and how heartbroken she would be to see what their children had become. Mostly, he thought about the generations of students he had guided, always believing that even the most difficult behavior could be a learning opportunity. "Yes," he said finally. "I'm ready to deliver the most important lesson of my life." Friday evening arrived with a crisp autumn chill that matched the cold determination in Harold's heart. He prepared a simple but elegant meal: pot roast with Catherine's recipe, mashed potatoes, green beans from his garden that he had frozen at their peak, and of course, pecan pie for dessert. The table was set with the good china, crystal water glasses at each place. As he worked, Harold activated the recording devices James had helped him install throughout the main floor of his home. The security cameras were already running, their footage streaming to the secure server. Everything was in place for what James had called a teaching moment of biblical proportions. Michael arrived first, carrying a folder of documents and wearing an expression of somber concern that Harold now recognized as entirely theatrical. Rebecca and Thomas followed shortly after, and Harold noted how they immediately spread out through the house, Rebecca examining the kitchen with a critical eye, Thomas wandering through the living room as if assessing items for future sale. "Something smells great, Dad," Michael said, setting his folder on the side table with careful casualness. "Mom's pot roast recipe?" "The very same," Harold confirmed. "I thought a family discussion called for a proper family meal." Dinner began with superficial conversation, the grandchildren's activities, the changing fall colors, the forecast of an early winter. Harold observed how his children exchanged glances when they thought he wasn't looking, their body language betraying their nervousness about the discussion to come. As they finished the main course, Michael cleared his throat. "Dad, we wanted to talk to you about something important. Something we've all been concerned about." "Of course," Harold said, setting down his fork and giving them his full attention, the same focused gaze that had made students straighten in their chairs during his years as principal. "What's on your mind?" Rebecca took over, her attorney's training evident in her measured tone. "Dad, we've noticed some changes in you over the past year. Small things at first, forgetting appointments, misplacing items, some confusion about dates. And then bigger things," Thomas added, clearly following a rehearsed script. "Like the excessive donation to the school fund, and some odd investment decisions." "We're worried about you," Michael concluded, reaching for the folder he'd brought. "We've consulted with specialists who think you might be experiencing some cognitive decline. It's nothing to be ashamed of, it happens to many people your age." Harold nodded thoughtfully, giving no indication of his awareness of their scheme. "I see. And what do these specialists recommend?" Rebecca pulled several documents from Michael's folder. "We've prepared some paperwork that would allow us to help you manage your affairs. It's called a guardianship, and it would let us make decisions when things get confusing for you. It's really for your protection, Dad," Thomas added, his businessman's instinct for the hard sell coming to the fore. "There are so many scammers targeting seniors these days." Harold accepted the papers, reviewing them with deliberate care. The documents laid out in clinical language the transfer of all decision-making authority from Harold to his children, with Michael named as primary guardian and conservator of his estate. "This seems quite comprehensive," Harold said finally. "It would give you control over all my finances, my medical decisions, and even where I live." "Only because we love you and want what's best," Michael insisted, a note of impatience creeping into his voice. Dr. Larson's evaluation confirmed what we've been seeing. "You need help, Dad." Harold folded the papers carefully and set them aside. "Before I consider this, I'd like to share something with you. I've been working on updating my will, and I think now might be the perfect time to discuss it." His children exchanged surprised glances, clearly thrown off script. Rebecca recovered. "First, Dad, that's exactly the kind of complex legal matter we're talking about. You should have consulted me before doing anything with your will." "Perhaps," Harold agreed mildly. "But I found another attorney who specialized in exactly what I needed. In fact, I have copies for each of you." He rose and retrieved 3 sealed envelopes from his desk in the study, handing one to each child before returning to his seat. "Please, read them now. I'm interested in your thoughts." With obvious reluctance, his children opened the envelopes and began to read. Harold watched as their expressions transformed from confusion to shock to dismay. The new will began with a preamble that made Harold's complete mental competence clear, referencing Dr. Richard's comprehensive evaluation and including language that established any challenge to his competency would require extraordinary evidence to overcome. It continued with specific details of Harold's estate plan. The farmland would be placed in a conservation trust, never to be sold, with income from the working farm distributed equally among Harold's grandchildren upon their reaching the age of 30, bypassing their parents entirely. Harold's house and personal possessions would be donated to a foundation establishing a scholarship for future teachers from Grand Island Central High School. His financial assets would be divided, with 70% going to educational charities and 30% to be shared equally among his children, but with a crucial condition. Rebecca was the first to find her voice. "Dad, what is this?" "This condition can't be legal." "It's entirely legal," Harold replied calmly. "James Martinez assured me of that. He's quite an accomplished attorney, one of my former students. Actually, you'd be surprised how many of them have gone on to distinguished careers." Michael's face had flushed deep red. "You're disinheriting us if we attempt to establish guardianship over you?" That's exactly what I'm doing," Harold confirmed. The condition is simple: any child who petitions for guardianship or conservatorship over me, or who supports such a petition, forfeits their entire inheritance. That portion would then be divided among educational charities. Thomas slammed the document down. This is ridiculous. We're trying to help you. Are you? Harold asked, his voice hardening for the first time. Is that why you discussed selling the farmland Catherine's family has maintained for 4 generations? Is that why you researched adequate care facilities where Medicare would cover the basics? Is that why you conspired with Dr. Larson to produce a fraudulent cognitive assessment? The room fell silent, his children's faces frozen in stunned disbelief. Oh yes, Harold continued, his educator's voice now in full command of the room. I heard everything that day at Michael's house. Every word about your plans for my property, my money, and my future. I was standing right outside the study door while you plotted to have me declared incompetent. Dad, Rebecca began, her legal training kicking in. You misunderstood. I understood perfectly, Harold interrupted. Just as I understand that the cognitive assessment you arranged was designed to find impairment regardless of my actual condition. Just as I understand that this guardianship petition, he tapped the papers they had brought, has nothing to do with my welfare and everything to do with your financial interests. Harold stood, his full height and the moral authority of his decades as an educator making him seem to tower over them despite his age. I have spent my life teaching young people about consequences, he said, his voice steady despite the emotion behind it. About integrity, honesty, and respect. Somehow, I failed to instill those values in my own children. That is my greatest disappointment. You can't do this, Michael protested, but his voice lacked conviction. I already have, Harold replied. The will has been properly executed and filed. But more importantly, he gestured to the discreet cameras positioned in the corners of the dining room. This entire conversation is being recorded. If you proceed with your guardianship petition, this footage, along with the recording of your planning session at Michael's house and Dr. Richard's comprehensive evaluation confirming my competence, will be presented in court. His children stared at him in silence, the full implications of their failed scheme sinking in. Now, Harold said, his voice softening slightly, I have pecan pie for dessert. Catherine's recipe. While we eat, we can discuss how we move forward. From here, as a family that respects each other's autonomy, or as estranged relatives who will only see each other in court. The choice is entirely yours. Thomas was the first to speak, his entrepreneurial pragmatism asserting itself. You've outplayed us. I can acknowledge that. Rebecca, ever the attorney, was already calculating damage control. The will is solid. I'd have written it the same way if I were representing you against someone like me. Michael simply stared at the table, the reality of what they had attempted, and lost, evident in his slumped shoulders. Harold looked at his children, truly. Looked at them, and felt a complex mixture of disappointment, love, and hope. I don't want your inheritance to be your only motivation for treating me with dignity. I want to rebuild what we've lost here. But it will take time, honesty, and a genuine recommitment to the values this family once stood for. As he served the pecan pie, Harold Wilkins knew that the lesson he had delivered might be the most important of his long teaching career. Whether his children would truly learn from it remained to be seen, but he had done what good educators have always done, created a learning opportunity and provided clear consequences for choices made. And in doing so, he had secured not just his assets but his dignity, his independence, and perhaps most importantly, his legacy as a man who stood up for his principles, even when those challenging them were the people he loved most in the world. The following Saturday morning found Harold in his garden, methodically preparing the soil for winter as he had done every autumn for decades. The physical labor helped clear his mind, the rhythm of turning earth with his spade creating a soothing counterpoint to the emotional turmoil of the previous night's confrontation. He paused, straightening his back and looking over the neat rows of his vegetable garden, now mostly harvested except for a few late-season root vegetables and winter squash. The golden October sun warmed his face as he considered how quickly life could change. Just a week ago, he had been blissfully unaware of his children's betrayal, living in the comfortable illusion that family bonds were sacrosanct. Now he found himself in an uncertain new reality, his legal position secure thanks to James's excellent work, but his emotional landscape forever altered. The sound of tires on gravel interrupted his thoughts. Harold turned to see a familiar blue sedan pulling into his driveway, Eleanor Thompson, his former vice principal and closest friend since Catherine's passing. At 73, Eleanor maintained the brisk efficiency and no-nonsense demeanor that had made her both respected and slightly feared by generations of students at Grand Island Central. I brought coffee and cinnamon rolls, she announced, holding up a paper bag as she approached the garden. And you're going to tell me why you've been avoiding my calls for the past 3 weeks? Harold smiled despite himself. Eleanor had always had an uncanny ability to sense when something was wrong, a skill that had served them well during their decades working together. Let me wash up, he said, brushing soil from his hands. This conversation requires caffeine and sugar. Seated at his kitchen table minutes later, Harold recounted everything: the overheard conversation, the consultation with James, the fraudulent cognitive assessment, and finally, last night's confrontation with his children. Eleanor listened without interruption, her expression growing increasingly grave. Those ungrateful little, she began, then caught herself. I always thought we raised better students than we raised children, Harold. At least yours turned out successful, even if they're morally bankrupt. My Stanley still lives in my basement at 45. Harold chuckled despite the situation. Eleanor's candor had always been refreshing. I don't think I failed them as a father, Ellie. I think they failed themselves as human beings. So, what happens now? She asked, cutting directly to the practical question as she always had during school crises. That depends on them, Harold replied, pouring more coffee for both of them. The ball is in their court. They can either abandon their guardianship scheme and work to rebuild our relationship, or they can proceed and lose their inheritance. Eleanor's shrewd eyes studied him. And which outcome are you hoping for? Harold stared into his coffee cup, considering the question carefully. I want my children back, he said finally. Not the people they've become, but the people they were meant to be. I want them to remember the values Catherine and I taught them. But I'm not willing to sacrifice my dignity or independence for that reconciliation. Good, Eleanor said firmly. Because I've been named your healthcare proxy in this new will, and I refuse to make medical decisions for a pushover. They both laughed, the tension breaking momentarily. Harold had chosen Eleanor for this role not just because of their friendship, but because of her unflinching integrity and practical wisdom. If difficult decisions ever needed to be made about his care, Eleanor would make them based on his wishes and best interests, not financial considerations. Have you heard from any of them today? She asked. Not yet, Harold admitted. I'm not expecting to. They need time to lick their wounds and reconsider their positions. Eleanor nodded thoughtfully. Just remember, whatever they decide, you're not alone in this. You have me, you have James, and you have half the town who still considers Principal Wilkins a local legend. After Eleanor left, Harold spent the afternoon completing necessary tasks, documenting the previous night's conversation in his journal, securing the digital recordings, and reviewing the materials James had prepared for him in case his children decided to proceed with their guardianship petition despite the consequences. As evening approached, his phone rang. Harold checked the caller ID, surprised to see Thomas's name on the screen. His youngest had always been the most pragmatic of his children, and perhaps the most transparent in his motivations. Hello, Thomas, Harold answered, keeping his voice neutral. Dad, Thomas began, an unfamiliar hesitation in his typically confident tone. I've been thinking about last night. About everything. He paused. I want to meet with you. Just the two of us. Would that be okay? Harold considered the request. Yes, I think that would be good. When did you have in mind? Tomorrow afternoon? I could come by around 2. I'll expect you then, Harold replied. After hanging up, Harold contemplated what this development might mean. Was Thomas reaching out as a genuine first step toward reconciliation, or was he acting as the family's representative, testing the waters for a new approach to their scheme? Either way, Harold would be prepared. The following afternoon, Thomas arrived precisely at 2, dressed casually in jeans and a sweater rather than his usual business attire. He seemed nervous, shifting his weight from foot to foot on the porch like he had as a child when confessing to some misdeed. Come in, Harold said, leading him to the living room where they sat in awkward silence for a moment. Dad, Thomas began finally. I owe you an apology. What we tried to do, what I participated in, was wrong. Completely wrong. Harold studied his youngest son, searching his face for signs of sincerity. What changed your mind, Thomas? Thomas ran a hand through his hair, a gesture so reminiscent of his teenage years that Harold felt a pang of nostalgia. Honestly? After I left last night, I called my financial advisor. I wanted to know if there was any way to challenge your new will. He gave a rueful smile. He said it was ironclad. Then he asked me a question that kept me up all night. What question was that? He asked me if getting my hands on your money was worth destroying my relationship with my father. Worth teaching my own kids that their inheritance matters more than their grandfather's dignity. Thomas shook his head. When he put it that way, I felt ashamed. Really ashamed. Harold nodded, acknowledging the admission without immediately accepting the apology. And Michael and Rebecca? What's their position? Thomas sighed. They're still processing. Rebecca's professional pride is wounded, she can't believe another attorney outmaneuvered her. And Michael? He hesitated. Michael's anger is masking his shame. He was the driving force behind this whole plan, convinced that expanding his business was more important than respecting your wishes for the farmland. I see, Harold said. And what about you, Thomas? What do you want now? I want a second chance, Thomas said simply. I want to rebuild your trust, even though I know I don't deserve it. I'm prepared to sign a legal document renouncing any claim to guardianship over you, now or in the future. Harold felt a small measure of hope stirring within him. That's a start, Thomas. But rebuilding trust takes more than legal documents. It takes time, consistency, and genuine effort to understand the harm that's been done. I know, Thomas acknowledged. I'm willing to put in that effort, Dad. Whatever it takes. Harold considered his son's words carefully before responding. I appreciate you coming here today, Thomas. Your willingness to acknowledge the wrong and take the first step toward making amends means a great deal to me. But I need to know that this isn't just about the inheritance. It's not, Thomas insisted. The money was never worth losing you. I see that now. I got caught up in Michael's plans and Rebecca's legal strategies, and I lost sight of what really matters. Which is family, Thomas said. Real family, the kind that supports each other, respects each other, and acts with integrity. The kind you and Mom always tried to create. Harold felt his heart softening despite his determination to remain guarded. I'd like to believe that, Thomas. I really would. Let me prove it to you, Thomas said earnestly. Not just with words, but with actions. Starting today. Over the next 2 weeks, Thomas began making good on his promise. He visited Harold regularly, sometimes helping with yard work or home maintenance, other times simply sharing a meal and conversation. He brought his children, Harold's grandchildren, for Sunday dinners, re-establishing a tradition that had lapsed in recent years. Most significantly, Thomas arranged a meeting with James Martinez where he formally signed a document renouncing any current or future claim to guardianship over his father. James reported to Harold afterward that Thomas had been respectful and seemed genuinely committed to making amends. He asked a lot of questions about how to best support you while respecting your independence, James told Harold during their weekly phone call. That's a good sign. He's thinking about the right issues now. Michael and Rebecca, however, remained distant. Harold received a terse email from Rebecca stating that she was reconsidering her position and consulting with colleagues about the situation. Michael had not communicated at all since the night of the confrontation. Then, 3 weeks after the family dinner that had changed everything, Harold received an unexpected visitor. He was in his workshop behind the house, carefully crafting a dollhouse for his youngest granddaughter's upcoming birthday, when he heard a vehicle pull into his driveway. Through the workshop window, he saw Michael's truck parked next to his own Ford pickup. Harold set down his tools and wiped his hands on a shop towel, mentally preparing himself for whatever this visit might bring. When he entered the kitchen, through the back door, he found Michael standing awkwardly by the counter, a thick folder tucked under his arm. Dad, Michael nodded stiffly. Thomas said you'd be home. I need to talk to you. I'm listening, Harold replied, gesturing toward the kitchen table. Michael sat down, placing the folder in front of him like a shield. I've been doing a lot of thinking since that night. About what we tried to do. About what kind of person I've become. Harold noticed the dark circles under his son's eyes, the rumpled appearance of his normally immaculate clothes. Go on, he said quietly. I was wrong, Michael said, the words seeming to physically pain him. Completely wrong. Not just about the guardianship plan, but about everything. About what matters. About who I am. Harold remained silent, allowing his son to continue without interruption. I convinced myself that expanding the business was the most important thing, Michael continued. That securing the capital justified any means. I told myself that you wouldn't understand because you've never run a business, never had employees depending on you. He opened the folder, revealing architectural drawings and business plans. This was going to be my legacy. Agricultural supply. Centers across 3 states. My name on buildings. My picture in business magazines. Harold studied the elaborate plans, understanding for the first time the scale of Michael's ambitions. It's an impressive vision, he acknowledged. It's an empty one, Michael corrected him. Because to achieve it, I was willing to betray my own father. To have you declared incompetent. To put you in a facility where his voice broke. Where you'd live out your days alone, away from your home, your garden, your workshop. The places Mom loved. Harold felt his own eyes growing moist. Why, Michael? That's what I still don't understand. Why not just talk to me? Ask for my help? Michael's face flushed with shame. Because I knew what you'd say. You'd remind me that the farmland was Mom's family legacy. That she wanted it preserved, not sold off to fund my ambitions. And you'd be right. He closed the folder decisively. So I took the coward's way. I convinced myself you were declining. That taking control was for your own good. And now? Harold asked. Now. I see myself clearly for the first time in years, Michael replied. And I don't like what I see. I've become the kind of man you warned me about when I was young, someone who measures success only in dollars, who sees people as means to an end. He reached into his jacket pocket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on the table between them. This is a formal letter renouncing any claim to guardianship over you, now or in the future. Thomas told me he signed something similar. I've had it notarized. Harold picked up the envelope but didn't open it. Thank you. That's a meaningful step. It's the bare minimum, Michael corrected him. I know that. I also know that I've done damage that can't be undone with a single letter or conversation. That's true, Harold agreed. Trust, once broken, isn't easily restored. Michael nodded, then straightened his shoulders. I'd like to try, though. To earn back your trust. To become the son you deserve. The son Mom would be proud of. And your business expansion? Harold asked, genuinely curious about how Michael was reconciling his ambitions with this apparent change of heart. I'm scaling it back, Michael said. Finding other financing sources for a smaller, more sustainable growth plan. It will take longer, but I'll build it the right way. With integrity. Harold studied his eldest son, searching for signs of the manipulation he had seen so clearly 3 weeks ago. Instead, he saw genuine remorse and something he hadn't expected, vulnerability. This won't be a quick or easy process, Michael, Harold said finally. Rebuilding what's been broken will take time and consistent effort. I know, Michael replied. I'm prepared for that. Whatever it takes. As Michael left that afternoon, Harold felt cautiously optimistic. 2 of his 3 children had taken concrete steps toward reconciliation, acknowledging their wrongdoing and committing to change. But Rebecca, his middle child, the daughter who had most closely followed in his professional footsteps with her attention to detail and analytical mind, remained distant and unresolved. Harold didn't have to wait long for Rebecca's response. The following morning, his doorbell rang at precisely 9 o'clock. When he opened the door, he found Rebecca standing on his porch, dressed in her most formal business attire, her expression unreadable. May I come in? She asked, her tone more appropriate for a client meeting than a father-daughter conversation. Harold invited her inside, noticing that she carried her signature leather portfolio, the one she used for her most important cases. They settled in the living room, Rebecca perching on the edge of the sofa as if prepared to make a formal presentation. I've conducted a thorough review of the situation, she began, her voice professional and detached. Both from a legal and personal perspective. Harold waited, recognizing Rebecca's need to approach emotional matters through the framework of logical analysis. My initial conclusion was that your new will could potentially be challenged on grounds of undue influence by this attorney, James Martinez, she continued. However, upon further research, I've determined that such a challenge would be unlikely to succeed given the comprehensive documentation of your competence and the circumstances surrounding our actions. I see, Harold said. And what personal conclusions have you reached? Rebecca's professional facade cracked slightly. That's more difficult to articulate. Try, Harold encouraged gently. No legal terminology required. She set her portfolio aside, her shoulders slumping slightly. I betrayed you, Dad. I used my legal training you helped pay for, to try to take away your autonomy. I justified it as protecting you, but that was a lie I told myself. Why did you go along with Michael's plan? Harold asked. You've always been the independent thinker. Rebecca looked down at her hands. Partly professional arrogance. I thought I knew better than you what was in your best interest. Partly financial incentive. My practice has been struggling, and my share of the farmland sale would have solved that problem. But mostly. She hesitated. Mostly? Harold prompted. I've spent my career building a reputation as someone who gets results for clients, Rebecca admitted. When Michael approached me about helping with this guardianship plan, my first instinct was to say no. But then I thought about the family dynamics. If I refused, I'd be the outsider. The difficult one. Again. Harold understood immediately. Rebecca had always been the middle child, struggling to find her place between Michael's confident leadership and Thomas's natural charm. So you agreed to be part of it to maintain your place in the family? Yes, she said simply. Which is ironic, because in doing so, I risked losing the most important family relationship of all, my relationship with you. She reached into her portfolio and withdrew a document. Like Michael and Thomas, I've prepared a formal renunciation of any guardianship claims. But I've taken it a step further. She handed him the document, which Harold recognized as a formal ethics self-report to the Nebraska Bar Association. You're reporting yourself for ethical violations? Rebecca nodded, her professional composure finally breaking as tears formed in her eyes. What I did wasn't just a betrayal of you, Dad. It was a betrayal of my professional oath. I used my legal knowledge to attempt to deprive a competent individual of their civil rights for financial gain. That's a serious ethical breach. Harold was stunned by the potential professional consequences of such a self-report. Rebecca, this could impact your license to practice law. I know, she said, wiping away tears. I'll likely face a disciplinary hearing, possible suspension, and mandatory ethics training. But it's the right thing to do. I can't reconcile who I've become with who I was raised to be without taking full responsibility for my actions. Harold felt a profound sense of respect for his daughter's courage. Of his 3 children, Rebecca was taking the most concrete and potentially costly step toward genuine accountability. This couldn't have been an easy decision, he said. It wasn't, she agreed. But when I really examined the situation, not as your daughter or as Michael's sister, but as an attorney sworn to uphold justice, I realized there was no other ethical choice. What we tried to do to you was wrong on every level. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of her decision hanging between them. What will you do if you're suspended from practice? Harold asked finally. Rebecca gave a small, sad smile. I've been thinking about that. I might use the time to refocus my practice. Move away from estate planning toward elder advocacy. Use my knowledge to protect seniors from exactly the kind of scheme we tried to perpetrate. Harold reached across and took his daughter's hand. That would be a meaningful way to create something positive from this experience. Do you think you can ever trust me again, Dad? Rebecca asked, the question clearly costing her considerable emotional effort. I think, Harold said carefully, that trust is rebuilt through actions, not words. What you're doing now, taking full responsibility, accepting consequences, contemplating how to make amends, those are the actions of someone worthy of trust. As Rebecca left that afternoon, Harold felt the emotional weight of the past month beginning to lift slightly. All 3 of his children had acknowledged their wrongdoing and taken concrete steps toward making amends. The road to full reconciliation would be long and undoubtedly difficult, but the first crucial steps had been taken. That evening, Harold sat in his study, adding the day's events to the journal he had been keeping since discovering his children's betrayal. As he documented Rebecca's ethical self-reporting, he reflected on the nature of family bonds, betrayal, and forgiveness. He thought about Catherine and what she would make of all this. Her practical wisdom had always been his north star, especially in matters of family. Family isn't just about blood, she used to say. It's about choices. The choice to love, to support, to forgive, and sometimes, the choice to establish boundaries when necessary. Harold closed his journal and moved to the window, watching as the first stars appeared in the Nebraska sky. The confrontation that had begun a month ago when he overheard his children's plot had transformed into something he hadn't expected, an opportunity for genuine growth and renewed connection, not just for him but for his children as well. The path forward wasn't clear yet, and Harold harbored no illusions that the damage could be quickly or easily repaired. But for the first time since that fateful dinner at Michael's house, he felt genuinely hopeful about his family's future. Not because his legal position was secure, though it was, but because his children were beginning to rediscover the values he and Catherine had tried to instill in them throughout their lives. As darkness fell over Grand Island, Harold Wilkins, former principal, father, and now unexpected teacher in the most important lesson of his family's life, allowed himself to believe that sometimes, being forgotten in a room could lead to being truly seen and valued for the first time in years. 6 weeks had passed since Harold overheard his children's plot, and the late November winds now swept across Nebraska's bare fields, carrying the promise of the first winter snow. Harold stood at his kitchen window, watching a cardinal, brilliant red against the gray landscape, hop along the bird feeder he had filled that morning. Inside, the aroma of simmering soup filled the house, a recipe Catherine had perfected over decades of Nebraska winters. The kitchen table behind him was covered with papers, photos, and handwritten notes, the raw materials for the project that had consumed his attention for the past month. It had begun as a simple idea during one of his conversations with Eleanor, but had evolved into something more significant, more healing, than he had initially imagined. The ringing telephone interrupted his thoughts. Harold answered to hear James Martinez's professional tone. "Mr. Wilkins, I wanted to update you before the weekend. Rebecca's disciplinary hearing with the Bar Association has been scheduled for December 15th. They're taking her self-report very seriously. Harold felt a twinge of concern for his daughter. Will they suspend her license? It's possible, James acknowledged. But her voluntary self-reporting and the steps she's taken toward remediation will work in her favor. I've offered to provide a statement about the circumstances, if you're comfortable with that. Harold considered this. Yes, I think that would be appropriate. She made a serious mistake, but she's taking responsibility in a way that deserves recognition. I agree, James said. On another note, I've reviewed the documentation for your new project. Legally, everything is in order. The foundation structure is sound, and the provisions you've included are both practical and meaningful. It's quite remarkable, if I may say so. Thank you, James. It's been therapeutic to channel my energy into something constructive. After hanging up, Harold returned to the papers on his table, organizing them into neat stacks before placing them in a leather portfolio, similar to Rebecca's, but weathered with age and use. It had been his companion throughout his years as an educator, carrying lesson plans, student evaluations, and the notes for countless speeches at school assemblies and graduation ceremonies. The doorbell rang at precisely noon, right on schedule. Harold opened the door to find Thomas standing on the porch, stamping his feet against the cold. Right on time, Harold smiled, gesturing his son inside. The soup's almost ready. Their weekly lunches had become a new tradition over the past month, sometimes just the two of them, sometimes including Thomas's children. Today, Thomas had come alone, carrying a folder of his own. I've finished digitizing those old family photos you asked about, Thomas said, hanging his coat on the rack by the door. Over 600 of them, all scanned and organized by year. I included some from my own collection too, pictures of Mom with the grandkids that you might not have. Harold accepted the folder with genuine appreciation. Thank you, Thomas. This will be perfect for what I have in mind. As they settled at the kitchen table with bowls of Catherine's vegetable soup, Thomas noticed the organized stacks of papers. Working on something important? Yes, Harold said, stirring his soup thoughtfully. Something I should have done. Years ago, actually. But sometimes it takes a significant event to provide the necessary perspective. Thomas's expression grew somber. You mean our betrayal? Harold nodded, not softening the truth of what had happened. Over the past weeks, he had been careful to acknowledge the reality of his children's actions even as they worked to rebuild their relationships. Genuine reconciliation, he believed, required unflinching honesty about the harm that had been done. Sometimes, Harold said, a crisis forces us to reevaluate what matters most. To consider the legacy we want to leave behind. Is that what this project is about? Your legacy? In a way, Harold replied. But not just mine. Your mother's too. And in some sense, all of ours. After lunch, Thomas helped clear the dishes, the domestic routine now comfortable between them in a way it hadn't been for years. As an adult, Thomas had always been somewhat distant, focused on his business ventures and own family, maintaining a polite but somewhat superficial relationship with his father. The crisis had, ironically, created space for a more authentic connection. Have you heard from Rebecca? Thomas asked as he dried the last bowl. She hasn't returned my calls this week. Harold nodded. She's preparing for her disciplinary hearing next month. It's weighing heavily on her. I still can't believe she reported herself to the bar, Thomas said, shaking his head. That took real courage. Your sister has always held herself to high standards, Harold observed. Sometimes impossibly high. In that way, she's very much like your mother. Thomas smiled at the comparison. Mom never let any of us get away with cutting corners. Remember how she made me redo my entire science project in 8th grade because she caught me fudging one of the experiments? I remember you complaining that none of the other parents were that strict, Harold chuckled. And Catherine saying, other parents aren't raising a Wilkins. Thomas finished the quote, his expression softening with the memory. She was right, of course. The project I redid won first place at the science fair. Catherine always played the long game when it came to character development, Harold said. She understood that temporary discomfort often leads to lasting growth. As Thomas prepared to leave, he hesitated at the door. Dad, there's something I wanted to ask you. The family has always gathered at Michael's house for Christmas Eve, but given everything that's happened. Harold considered the question that hung unspoken between them. The family's holiday traditions had been established long ago, Christmas Eve dinner at Michael's farmhouse, Christmas morning at Harold's for breakfast and gifts. Would those traditions continue after all that had transpired? I think, Harold said carefully, that traditions are important, especially during times of healing. But perhaps this year calls for something new. A fresh start of sorts. Thomas nodded, understanding. What did you have in mind? I'll give it some thought, Harold promised. And I'll let all of you know soon. After Thomas left, Harold returned to his project, adding the newly digitized photos to the materials he had gathered. For the next several hours, he worked methodically, organizing, writing, and occasionally pausing to smile at a particularly meaningful photograph or memory. The following Tuesday brought Michael to his door, right on schedule for their own newly established routine. While Thomas's visits were casual and conversational, Michael had taken a more practical approach to rebuilding their relationship, arriving each week with tools and a determined expression, tackling the home maintenance projects that Harold had been deferring. Today, Michael came prepared to install the programmable thermostat Harold had mentioned during his last visit, a small upgrade that would make the house more energy efficient during the cold Nebraska winter. "Where do you want it, Dad?" Michael asked, surveying the existing thermostat in the hallway. "Same location, or were you thinking somewhere more convenient?" "Same location is fine," Harold replied. "No need to patch walls unnecessarily." As Michael worked, Harold observed the changes in his eldest son over the past weeks. The corporate casual attire had been replaced by comfortable work clothes. The constant checking of his phone for business messages had diminished. Most notably, the driven, almost aggressive energy that had characterized Michael for years had softened into something more measured and thoughtful. "How's the business?" Harold asked, handing Michael a screwdriver when he reached for it. Michael's expression grew contemplative. "Smaller than I planned, but healthier in many ways. I've been focusing on quality over expansion, improving our service, building stronger relationships with existing customers instead of just chasing new ones." "And how does that feel?" "Honestly?" Michael looked up from his work. "It feels right. I was so fixated on growth that I lost sight of why I started the business in the first place, to serve the agricultural community, not just to make money." Harold nodded, understanding. "Your grandfather, your mother's father, used to say that a business that only makes money is a poor business indeed." "I've been thinking about Grandpa a lot lately," Michael admitted. "About how he ran his farm. How he valued stability and sustainability over quick profits. How he treated his employees like family." He secured the thermostat to the wall and began connecting the wiring. "I've been implementing some of his practices at the store: profit sharing with employees, flexible scheduling for family needs, community investment." "He would be proud of that," Harold said softly. Michael completed the installation in comfortable silence, then tested the new thermostat to ensure it was working properly. As he packed up his tools, he seemed to be gathering courage for something more. "Dad," he began hesitantly, "I've been meaning to ask you something about the farmland." Harold felt a momentary tension. The farmland had been at the center of his children's scheme, the asset they had most coveted. "What about it?" "I've been thinking about its future," Michael said carefully. "Not about selling it, I understand now why that would dishonor Mom's family legacy. But about how it's being used." Harold relaxed slightly, intrigued by this unexpected direction. "Go on." "The current tenant farmer is doing conventional agriculture, corn and soybeans, heavy on chemical inputs. It's profitable, but..." Michael hesitated. "It's not what Grandpa would have wanted. Not what Mom would have wanted either." "No," Harold agreed. "It isn't. I've been researching regenerative agricultural practices," Michael continued, his passion for the subject evident in his voice. "Methods that build soil health, sequester carbon, create habitat for wildlife. It would mean less profit in the short term, but in the long run, it would preserve the land for generations to come." Harold studied his son with new eyes, seeing a glimpse of the man Catherine had always believed Michael could become. "That sounds like something worth pursuing." "The current lease is up for renewal next year," Michael said. "I thought maybe, if you were open to it, I could help find a tenant who shares these values. Someone who would steward the land the way Grandpa did." "I think your mother would have loved that idea," Harold said, genuinely moved by the unexpected proposal. "We can certainly explore it together." As Michael prepared to leave, he paused at the door. "Thomas mentioned you might be changing the Christmas plans this year." "I've been considering it," Harold confirmed. "I think this year calls for something different. Something meaningful for where we are now as a family." Michael nodded, understanding. "Whatever you decide, I'm on board. Just let me know what you need from me." The following week brought a rare snowfall to Grand Island, transforming the landscape into a winter wonderland that reminded Harold of Christmases long past. He spent the morning clearing his driveway and sidewalk, then drove carefully to Rebecca's office in downtown Grand Island. Unlike his regular meetings with Thomas and Michael, his interactions with Rebecca had been more formal and less frequent, partly due to her busy schedule preparing for the disciplinary hearing, and partly, Harold suspected, because of her deep shame over her role in the guardianship scheme. Her office was located in a renovated historic building, its brick exterior adorned with tasteful holiday decorations. Inside, the reception area was empty except for Rebecca's assistant, who greeted Harold warmly and directed him to Rebecca's private office. He found his daughter surrounded by legal books and documents, her normally impeccable appearance slightly disheveled from what had clearly been a long day of preparation. She looked up as he entered, surprise and then pleasure crossing her face. "Dad, I wasn't expecting you. Is everything all right?" "Everything's fine," Harold assured her, taking the seat she offered across from her desk. "I was in town and thought I'd stop by. See how you're holding up." Rebecca's professional composure slipped for a moment, revealing the anxiety beneath. "I'm managing. The hearing is next week. My attorney thinks I'll likely receive a 6-month suspension, followed by probation and mandatory ethics training." "How do you feel about that?" Harold asked gently. "Terrified," she admitted. "Embarrassed. But also, relieved, in a way. Like I'm finally being held accountable for something I knew was wrong from the beginning." Harold nodded, understanding. Accountability can be clarifying, even when it's painful. "The timing is difficult, though," Rebecca continued. "Being suspended right before the holidays, having to explain to colleagues and clients." "Which brings me to one reason for my visit," Harold said. "I've been thinking about our family Christmas traditions, and I believe this year calls for something different. Something that acknowledges what we've been through while creating space for where we might go from here." Rebecca looked at him curiously. "What did you have in mind?" "I'd like to host Christmas Eve at my house this year," Harold explained. "Not just dinner, but a special gathering. I've been working on something, a project of sorts, that I'd like to share with all of you." "Of course," Rebecca agreed immediately. "Whatever you want, Dad." Harold reached into his coat pocket and withdrew an envelope, placing it on her desk. "This is for you. Part of what I've been working on." Rebecca looked at the envelope with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "Should I open it now?" "No," Harold said, rising from his chair. "Save it for Christmas Eve. I've given similar envelopes to Thomas and Michael. They're invitations, in a sense, but also something more." As he prepared to leave, Rebecca came around her desk and embraced him with uncharacteristic emotion. "Thank you for coming today," she whispered. "It means more than you know." "You're going to get through this, Rebecca," Harold assured her. "And you'll be a better attorney, a better person, on the other side." The days leading up to Christmas passed in a flurry of preparation. Harold enlisted Eleanor's help with some of the arrangements, enjoying her practical approach and dry humor as they worked together to transform his home for the gathering he had planned. "Are you sure about this?" Eleanor asked as they organized the dining room. "It's quite a dramatic gesture." "I'm sure," Harold said firmly. "It feels right. Necessary, even." "Well, it's certainly going to be memorable," Eleanor observed. "And goodness knows your family could use a dose of perspective after what they tried to pull." The morning of Christmas Eve dawned clear and cold, the winter sun casting long shadows across the snow-covered landscape. Harold rose early, reviewing his notes one final time before beginning the preparations for the evening's gathering. By mid-afternoon, everything was ready, the house decorated with Catherine's cherished holiday ornaments, the dining table set with her best china, the fireplace crackling with warmth against the winter chill. At precisely 5 o'clock, the doorbell rang. Harold opened it to find all 3 of his children standing together on the porch, a united front, but with uncertainty rather than conspiracy in their expressions. Behind them, their spouses and children waited, arms laden with gifts and holiday dishes. "Merry Christmas, Dad," Thomas said, stepping forward to embrace him. "Welcome," Harold replied, genuinely pleased to see them all together. Come in, come in. There's hot cider warming on the stove." The next hour passed in a blur of activity, coats being hung, gifts arranged under the tree, grandchildren exploring the house with excited energy, dishes being organized in the kitchen. Harold observed it all with a bittersweet appreciation, noting how normal it all appeared on the surface. Only he and his children knew the profound shift that had occurred beneath this facade of holiday tradition. As they gathered in the living room before dinner, Harold noticed his children exchanging glances, clearly curious about the envelopes they had each received and the mysterious project he had mentioned. Michael's wife Diane was discussing holiday recipes with Thomas's wife Jennifer, while Rebecca's husband Paul entertained the grandchildren with an animated retelling of A Christmas Carol. "Before we move to the dining room," Harold said, his voice cutting through the various conversations, "I'd like to share something with all of you. Something I've been working on for the past month." The room quieted, all eyes turning toward him. Harold retrieved his leather portfolio from the side table and opened it carefully. As you know, this past year has brought significant challenges to our family, he began, his tone gentle but direct. Challenges that have forced us to confront difficult truths about ourselves and our relationships with one another. His children exchanged uncomfortable glances, aware that their spouses and children knew nothing of the guardianship scheme or its aftermath. Rather than dwelling on those difficulties, Harold continued, I've chosen to use them as an opportunity for reflection and growth. To consider what legacy I wish to leave behind, not just materially, but in terms of values and wisdom. He withdrew a leather-bound book from the portfolio, its cover embossed with the words, The Wilkins Family Legacy, in elegant gold lettering. This is not a legal document, Harold explained, though it has legal implications that James has helped me formalize. Rather, it's a record, a testament, if you will, to the values that have shaped our family across generations. Values that your mother and I tried to instill in each of you, and values that I hope will continue to guide this family long after I'm gone. He opened the book to reveal beautifully arranged photographs, handwritten notes, and carefully typed passages. It contains stories from your grandparents' lives, wisdom from your mother that some of you may never have heard, reflections on my own journey, and hopes for your futures and those of your children. Harold handed the book to Rebecca, who accepted it with visibly trembling hands. I've had copies made for each of your families, he continued, but this is the original. I'd like you to take turns reading from it this evening, starting with the passage marked for tonight. Rebecca found the ribbon bookmark and opened to the indicated page. She began to read, her attorney's voice steady despite the emotion visible on her face. To my beloved children, Michael, Rebecca, and Thomas, on this Christmas Eve, I want to share with you the greatest lesson I have learned in my 75 years, that our legacy is not measured in assets or achievements, but in the lives we touch and the values we uphold. The recent events in our family have reminded me that even the strongest bonds can be tested by misplaced priorities and poor choices. But they have also shown me that redemption is possible when we have the courage to acknowledge our mistakes and commit to genuine change. The farmland that became the center of our conflict has been placed in a conservation trust, as you now know. But tonight, I want to explain why this matters so deeply to me, and why it should matter to you. Rebecca paused, looking up at her father with new understanding dawning in her eyes. Harold nodded encouragingly, and she continued reading. Your grandfather acquired this land during the Great Depression, when many families were losing their farms to foreclosure. He worked 3 jobs to make the payments, believing that land, properly cared for, was the most valuable legacy he could leave his children. Your mother grew up understanding this sacrifice. She learned that the land was not merely an asset to be monetized, but a responsibility to be honored. When we married, she made me promise that the farmland would be preserved for future generations, not as a financial inheritance, but as a living testament to the values of stewardship, sustainability, and respect for what came before us. In your eagerness to convert this legacy into cash, you nearly betrayed not just me, but the generations of sacrifice and wisdom that made our family what it is today. The room had grown completely silent, the only sound the crackling of the fire in Rebecca's clear voice. Even the grandchildren seemed to sense the importance of the moment, sitting unusually still and attentive. But here is what I want you to understand most deeply, Rebecca continued reading. A true legacy transcends material possessions. The most valuable inheritance I can leave you is not land or money, but the wisdom to use whatever you have in service of what truly matters. Therefore, on this Christmas Eve, I am not just sharing this book of family wisdom. I am inviting each of you to participate in creating the next chapter of our family's legacy, one defined by integrity, reconciliation, and purposeful living. The envelopes you received contain individual invitations to participate in the Wilkins Family Foundation, which I have established with James's assistance. This foundation will manage the income from the Farmland Trust, directing it toward educational opportunities for deserving students from Grand Island Central High School, sustainable agriculture initiatives, and elder advocacy programs. Each of you is being offered a position on the Foundation's board, with real responsibility for carrying these values forward. Not as a test or condition, but as an opportunity to transform our family's painful chapter into meaningful purpose. The choice to accept is entirely yours, as is the choice of what legacy you will create with your own lives from this moment forward. Rebecca closed the book, tears streaming freely down her face now. The room remained silent for a long moment, each person absorbing the profound message Harold had crafted. Michael was the first to speak, his voice thick with emotion. Dad, I don't know what to say. This is extraordinary. It's perfect, Thomas added. Absolutely perfect. Rebecca simply rose from her seat and embraced her father, words failing her completely. As the family moved toward the dining room, the atmosphere had transformed, the tension replaced by a palpable sense of possibility and renewed purpose. Harold took his place at the head of the table, looking at the faces of his children and grandchildren gathered around him. The painful betrayal that had begun when they forgot he was in the room had led, through a winding and difficult path, to this moment of genuine connection and shared vision. And as Harold prepared to carve the Christmas turkey, he felt Catherine's presence as strongly as if she were standing beside him, whispering the words she had so often shared during difficult times. Remember, Harold, sometimes the most painful lessons yield the most beautiful growth. Spring arrived in Nebraska with its characteristic unpredictability, one day offering gentle sunshine that coaxed crocuses from the soil, the next bringing biting winds that reminded everyone winter hadn't completely relinquished its grip. On this particular April morning, Harold stood in his garden, kneeling carefully beside the freshly turned earth as he planted Catherine's favorite tulip bulbs along the southern edge of the house. The past 4 months had transformed not just the landscape but Harold's family in ways he could scarcely have imagined when he first overheard his children's betrayal last autumn. The Christmas Eve revelation of the Wilkins family legacy book and foundation had marked a turning point, not an instant healing of all wounds, but the beginning of a genuine journey toward reconciliation and renewed purpose. Harold's hands, weathered but still strong, worked methodically through the soil, creating perfect spacing between each bulb. Gardening had always been a form of meditation for him, a chance to think while accomplishing something tangible and beautiful. Today, his thoughts centered on the foundation board meeting scheduled for later that afternoon, the third such gathering since Christmas, and perhaps the most significant yet. The sound of tires on gravel announced a visitor. Harold looked up to see Rebecca's sedan pulling into his driveway, earlier than he had expected her. At 47, his middle child had always been punctual to a fault, often arriving precisely on time, never early or late. This deviation from habit piqued Harold's curiosity. Rebecca emerged from her car looking different than she had just months ago. Gone was the polished, somewhat rigid corporate attorney appearance. Today she wore casual slacks and a simple blouse, her hair pulled back in a practical ponytail rather than the severe bun she had favored throughout her professional career. The change in her appearance reflected the profound shift in her life circumstances. "Dad," she called, walking toward the garden. "Sorry to arrive unannounced. I hope I'm not interrupting." "Never," Harold assured her, carefully placing his gardening tools aside and rising to greet her. "I'm just getting Catherine's tulips in. They'll bloom nicely for Mother's Day if I plant them now." Rebecca smiled at the mention of the tradition Harold had maintained since Catherine's passing, ensuring that her favorite flowers bloomed for the holiday she had always cherished. "Mom would appreciate that. She never could resist a well-planned garden." They moved inside, where Harold prepared coffee as Rebecca settled at the kitchen table, spreading out a folder of documents she had brought with her. "I wanted to review these with you before the board meeting," she explained. "The Elder Advocacy Program proposal has evolved significantly since our initial discussions." Harold nodded, bringing 2 mugs of coffee to the table. "Tell me what's changed." Rebecca's entire demeanor transformed as she began discussing the project that had become her passion over the past months. After serving her 6-month suspension from legal practice, a consequence of her self-reported ethical violation, she had channeled her expertise into developing the Foundation's Elder Advocacy Initiative. "We've expanded the scope beyond just legal protection," she explained, her eyes bright with purpose. "The program now includes 3 integrated components: legal advocacy, of course, but also financial literacy education and a volunteer companionship network." Harold studied the detailed proposal, impressed by the thoroughness and vision it represented. "This is remarkable work, Rebecca. You've created something comprehensive that addresses the root causes of elder exploitation, not just its symptoms." "That's exactly what I was aiming for," she acknowledged. "My experience as an estate planning attorney showed me that most elder abuse happens not because of lack of laws, but because of isolation, lack of financial knowledge, and inadequate support systems." She hesitated, then added more quietly, "And of course, my own actions taught me how easy it is to rationalize taking control from someone when you convince yourself it's for their own good." Harold reached across the table to squeeze her hand gently. "You've transformed that painful lesson into something that will help countless seniors maintain their dignity and independence. That's the definition of redemption, Rebecca." They spent the next hour reviewing the proposal in detail, Harold offering occasional suggestions from his educator's perspective. As they worked, he marveled at the change in their relationship. Before the crisis, their interactions had been respectful but somewhat distant, Rebecca treating him more like a beloved client than a father. Now there was an authenticity between them, a willingness to acknowledge both strengths and vulnerabilities that had never existed before. Have you spoken with Michael about the sustainable agriculture component? Harold asked as they finished their review. Rebecca nodded. We had lunch yesterday. His ideas for integrating educational programs with the regenerative farming practices on the family land are brilliant. He's a different person these days, Dad. More like the brother I remember from when we were kids, before the business consumed him. I've noticed that too, Harold agreed. The foundation work seems to have awakened something in him that had been dormant for too long. As Rebecca gathered her materials to leave, she paused, seeming to gather courage for something more personal. Dad, I've been meaning to tell you. Paul and I have been in marriage counseling since January. Harold tried to keep surprise from showing on his face. Rebecca and her husband had always presented a picture of perfect professional harmony, their marriage seemingly as organized and efficient as their careers. The whole guardianship scheme forced me to look at many aspects of my life, Rebecca continued. Including how much I've been hiding behind work, using professional success to avoid addressing the emotional distance in my marriage. That takes courage, Harold said simply. Both the recognition and the willingness to do something about it. Rebecca's smile was tinged with both sadness and hope. It's not easy, but it's necessary. Paul and I realized we've been more like business partners than spouses for years. We're trying to find our way back to something real. She checked her watch. I should go. I have an appointment with my career counselor before the board meeting. Career counselor? Harold asked. Yes, Rebecca confirmed. My suspension ends next month, and I need to decide what direction my legal practice will take. Whether I want to continue with estate planning at all, or perhaps focus exclusively on elder advocacy law. She shrugged slightly. Just because I'm good at something doesn't mean it's what I should be doing with my life. Another lesson from recent events. After Rebecca left, Harold returned to his gardening, reflecting on how the crisis had catalyzed growth not just in his relationship with his children, but in their individual lives as well. Rebecca reevaluating her career and marriage. Michael reconnecting with his grandfather's values through sustainable agriculture. Thomas, always the most entrepreneurial of the three, channeling his business acumen into developing the foundation's financial structure and investment policies. By mid-afternoon, Harold had finished planting the tulips and cleaned up his gardening tools. He showered and dressed for the foundation board meeting, selecting a tie Catherine had given him years ago, blue with small yellow flowers that had always reminded her of Nebraska prairie blooms. The Wilkins Family Foundation headquarters occupied a modest suite in a renovated historic building in downtown Grand Island. Harold had insisted on this location rather than more prestigious offices in Lincoln or Omaha, wanting to keep the foundation rooted in the community that had shaped their family for generations. As he pulled into the parking lot, Harold noticed all three of his children's vehicles already there, along with Eleanor's practical sedan. The fifth board member, James Martinez, would be joining virtually from his Omaha office, as he often did for the monthly meetings. Inside, the conference room reflected the foundation's values, beautiful but unpretentious, with furniture crafted by local artisans and walls adorned with photographs of the family farmland through changing seasons. The oak table that dominated the room had been salvaged from Grand Island Central High School during a renovation project, refinished by Michael himself as his contribution to the foundation's physical space. Dad, Thomas greeted him warmly, rising from his conversation with Eleanor. Perfect timing. We were just discussing the scholarship selection process. Harold took his seat at the head of the table, a position the others had insisted upon despite his initial reluctance. As the founder, they had argued, he should chair the board, at least for the first year. Before we begin the formal agenda, Harold said once everyone was settled and James had joined via video conference, I want to acknowledge a significant milestone. Today marks exactly 6 months since the creation of the Wilkins Family Foundation on Christmas Eve. The board members exchanged glances, clearly not having realized the significance of the date. In education, Harold continued, we often measure progress at semester intervals. So I think it's appropriate to reflect briefly on what we've accomplished in this first semester of our foundation's existence. Eleanor, ever practical, took up the thread. Well, we've established our legal and financial structures, developed our 3 core program areas, and made our first round of scholarship awards to 5 promising students from Grand Island Central. And we've begun the transition to regenerative agricultural practices on the family land, Michael added, his voice carrying an enthusiasm that had been missing for years when he discussed business matters. The new tenant farmer is implementing the first phase this growing season, with minimal yield reduction projected. The Elder Advocacy Program launches next month, Rebecca contributed. We've already recruited 15 volunteer attorneys to provide pro bono legal services, and 30 community volunteers for the companionship network. Thomas, who had taken responsibility for the foundation's community relations, smiled broadly. And we've raised an additional $75,000 in matching funds from community donors, extending our impact beyond what the farmland income alone could support. Harold listened with quiet pride as each board member detailed their area of progress. The foundation had indeed accomplished remarkable things in 6 months, but he knew the true achievement went far beyond programs and dollars. Those are all important milestones, he acknowledged when they had finished. But if you'll permit me a moment of sentimentality, I'd like to share what I consider our most significant achievement. He opened the leather portfolio he had brought, the same one that had contained the family legacy book on Christmas Eve. From it, he withdrew 5 photographs, placing them carefully on the table before him. This first photograph, he said, indicating a faded color image from the 1970s, shows the family farmland when Catherine's father still worked it himself. The careful stewardship evident in every fence line and windbreak. The second shows our family at the last Christmas before Catherine's passing, the strain evident in our forced smiles and awkward positioning, physically together but emotionally distant. The third photograph showed the confrontation at Harold's home when he had revealed his knowledge of their guardianship scheme, captured by the security cameras he had installed. The atmosphere in the conference room grew somber as they all recalled that painful evening. The fourth, Harold continued, his voice gentle but firm, shows our Christmas Eve gathering when the foundation was established. The shock and realization on your faces as Rebecca read from the legacy book. The beginning of something new from the ashes of something broken. He placed the final photograph in the center of the table. It had been taken just a month ago, showing all of them working together at a community garden the foundation had helped establish at Grand Island Central High School. In the image, Michael was demonstrating composting techniques to a group of students, Rebecca was reviewing plans for a butterfly garden with the ecology teacher, Thomas was organizing volunteers, and Harold was working alongside his grandchildren to plant a row of native prairie grasses. This, Harold said simply, is our greatest achievement. Not just the programs we've created or the dollars we've raised, but the transformation of our family from one divided by greed and deception to one united in purpose and service. The room fell silent, each person absorbing the visual journey Harold had presented. James, observing from the video screen, cleared his throat with evident emotion. If I may, the attorney said, as someone who witnessed this transformation from a unique perspective, I'd like to add something. In my 25 years of legal practice, I've seen countless families torn apart by inheritance disputes and elder exploitation. What makes the Wilkins family extraordinary isn't that you avoided these pitfalls, in fact, you nearly succumbed to them, but that you found the courage to transform your failure into something meaningful. Harold nodded in agreement. Which brings me to the main item on today's agenda. Now that we've established our foundation's core programs and seen them begin to bear fruit, I believe it's time to consider the next phase of our work together. He withdrew a final document from his portfolio, passing copies to each board member. This proposal outlines what I'm calling our Legacy Leadership Initiative. It's designed to extend the lessons our family has learned to others facing similar challenges. The board members reviewed the document with interest, Thomas being the first to grasp its significance. You want us to share our story? Publicly? Yes, Harold confirmed. Not as a confession or self-flagellation, but as an honest case study in how families can recover from betrayal and find renewed purpose through accountability and shared vision. Rebecca looked up from the proposal, her attorney's instincts clearly wrestling with the personal implications. This would mean acknowledging what we attempted to do to you, Dad. The fraudulent competency evaluation, the guardianship petition, all of it. It would, Harold agreed. But anonymously if you prefer, with names and identifying details changed. The point isn't to publicly shame anyone, but to provide a roadmap for other families struggling with similar issues. I think it's brilliant, Michael said, surprising everyone with his immediate support. The most powerful teaching tools are authentic stories of failure and redemption. That's something I've learned in my recovery journey. He had recently revealed to the family that he had joined a support group for people struggling with workaholism and status addiction, terms that would have made him scoff just months ago. The proposal includes workshops for families, educational materials for seniors and their adult children, and training for financial advisors and attorneys, Harold continued. All designed to promote healthy family conversations about aging, inheritance, and legacy before crisis forces these issues to the surface. Eleanor, who had been quietly reviewing the document, looked up with approval. This transforms your personal family crisis into a gift for countless others, Harold. It's exactly the kind of educational approach you always excelled at, turning difficult experiences into teachable moments. The discussion that followed was thoughtful and nuanced, each board member contributing perspectives from their professional expertise and personal growth. Rebecca suggested legal safeguards to protect all parties involved in sharing their story. Thomas proposed a phased implementation that would allow them to refine the program based on initial feedback. Michael offered to be the first to share his personal testimony, speaking frankly about how his ambition had blinded him to more important values. As the meeting concluded 2 hours later, the Legacy Leadership Initiative had been unanimously approved, with a planned launch in September, appropriately timed for the beginning of the academic year, as Harold had suggested. Outside the foundation offices, the spring evening had turned mild, with a gentle breeze carrying the scent of newly awakened earth. Harold stood in the parking lot with his children, reluctant to end this moment of shared accomplishment. "Dad," Michael said, "we were thinking maybe you'd join us for dinner?" Thomas found a new place on the edge of town that's supposed to have excellent prime rib. "Just like the family dinners we used to have when Mom was alive," Rebecca added, her expression hopeful. Harold felt a surge of gratitude for this simple invitation that represented so much more. "I'd like that very much," he replied. As they walked toward their cars, Thomas fell into step beside Harold. "I've been meaning to tell you something, Dad. I had lunch with Dr. Larson last week." Harold stopped, surprised. Dr. Larson had been the physician who provided the fraudulent cognitive assessment as part of the guardianship scheme. "What prompted that?" "Part of my own process," Thomas explained. "Coming to terms with everyone I involved in our plan against you." He shook his head, still visibly uncomfortable with the memory. "He was nervous about meeting me, afraid I might be recording the conversation like you did." "And what did you discuss?" Harold asked, genuinely curious. "I wanted to understand why he agreed to falsify a medical evaluation. As it turns out, he's been struggling financially, gambling debts, much like Michael's financial pressures. He saw our offer as an easy solution." Thomas's expression grew thoughtful. "The conversation made me realize how vulnerability exists. On both sides of elder exploitation, the seniors who are targeted, but also the professionals who compromise their ethics under pressure." Harold considered this insight. "That's an important perspective to include in our legacy leadership materials. The goal isn't to demonize anyone, but to create systems and relationships that support better choices." As they drove to the restaurant in separate cars, Harold reflected on the extraordinary journey of the past 6 months. From the moment of betrayal when his children had forgotten he was in the room during their plot, to this evening of shared purpose and genuine connection. The path had not been straight or easy, involving painful confrontations, difficult admissions, and ongoing work to rebuild trust. The restaurant Thomas had chosen was located in a renovated barn at the edge of town, its rustic elegance complemented by large windows overlooking newly planted fields stretching toward the horizon. As they were seated at a table near the fireplace, Harold noticed something he might have missed just months ago: the way his children interacted with each other had fundamentally changed. Michael listened attentively as Rebecca described a challenging aspect of the elder advocacy program, offering thoughtful suggestions rather than taking over the conversation. Thomas shared credit for a successful foundation fundraiser, acknowledging Michael's behind-the-scenes work that had secured a major donor. Rebecca asked genuine questions about Thomas's children, showing interest in their lives beyond perfunctory inquiries. They had become not just better children to him, but better siblings to each other, better parents to their own children, and better citizens of their community. The crisis that could have destroyed their family had instead catalyzed growth that none of them could have imagined. As their meal arrived, Harold raised his water glass in a simple toast. "To second chances," he said. "And to the wisdom to make the most of them." "To second chances," his children echoed, their glasses meeting with the clear ring of genuine commitment. Later that evening, as Harold drove home under a canopy of Nebraska stars, he found himself thinking of Catherine. She had always believed in the capacity for growth and change, even when evidence suggested otherwise. During their 47 years together, she had been his moral compass, gently but firmly guiding him back to his better nature when he strayed. "You were right, my love," he said aloud in the quiet of his truck. "They found their way back to the values we tried to instill. It just took a crisis to remind them of what truly matters." As he turned into his driveway, Harold noticed something that brought tears to his eyes. A single early tulip had bloomed near the porch, its yellow petals luminous in the moonlight. Catherine's favorite color, appearing weeks before the others should have flowered. Inside his home, Harold settled into his favorite chair, picking up the leather-bound legacy book that now held pride of place on his side table. He opened to a blank page near the end, one he had left for recording significant family moments yet to come. Under the date, he wrote, "Today, 6 months after the foundation's creation, we launched the Legacy Leadership Initiative, transforming our family's painful chapter into a resource for others facing similar challenges. The tulips are beginning to bloom earlier than expected. Like healing, like growth, like the restoration of what was broken, nature has its own timeline that cannot be rushed but can be nurtured. He closed the book, content in the knowledge that the legacy he would eventually leave behind was no longer just the physical assets he had accumulated over a lifetime, but the living testament of a family that had faced its darkest moment and emerged stronger, wiser, and more truly connected than ever before. Harold Wilkins, former high school principal, father, and now unexpected architect of his family's redemption, smiled as he looked toward the window where Catherine's early tulip caught the moonlight. Sometimes being forgotten in a room leads to being truly seen for the first time. And sometimes, the reading of a will becomes not an ending, but a beautiful, unexpected beginning. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell, so you don't miss any upload from us.